Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website and those who will be viewing us today on C-SPAN. We would also ask everyone in-house to make that last check that your cell phones have been turned off. That courtesy is always appreciated by our presenters. And we will post the program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference as well. Hosting our discussion today is Ana Quintana. Ana is our research associate for Latin America in the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. She earned her Bachelor's of Arts degree in Political Science at Florida International University, as well as certificates in National Security and Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Upon graduation, she studied in Brazil on a scholarship sponsored by the Defense Intelligence Agency. She later completed a Master's of Arts degree in Global Governance at Florida International School of International and Public Affairs. Prior to joining us here at Heritage, she worked at the Department of Defense as a student trainee for the summer of 2013. She has also interned with International Relief and Development, working on Latin America rule of law issues, and with the U.S. Agency for International Development, working on civilian-military cooperation. Please join me in welcoming Ana Quintana. Ana?
Thank you, John, and thank you all for joining us today for this discussion on the situation in Venezuela. I'd like to thank the panelists for preparing remarks for us today and for our moderator for facilitating today's discussion. For the past couple of weeks, Venezuela has been mired by deadly protest. Initiated by student demonstrators, hundreds of thousands of protesters are voicing their grievances against soaring crime rates, high levels of inflation, a shortage of basic goods, and a lack of political and economic freedom. The Venezuelan government has responded by brutally cracking down against the demonstrators. So far, 6 people have been killed and hundreds have been beaten, arrested, and tortured. The videos and pictures coming out of Venezuela show a seeming apocalyptic footage of the National Guard, police, and government-sponsored motorcycle gangs brutalizing unarmed protesters. Armed with automatic weapons, grenades, tear gas, and even tanks, the government is using all means to silence the democratic opposition. For the past 16 years, Venezuela has been on a downward spiral. The late leader, Hugo Chavez, left the country in absolute disaster. Society has been polarized, and the economy has essentially been decimated. The contradictions that exist in Venezuela don't really exist anywhere else. While the country has the world's largest proven oil reserves, it also has the highest levels of inflation and the largest debt in Latin America. In Heritage's Index of Economic Freedom, Venezuela ranks only above Zimbabwe, Cuba, and North Korea. It has the 3rd highest homicide rate in the world, with 25,000 people murdered yearly, yet over 90% of these homicides go unpunished. In recent months, under Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro, the situation has become more acute. You now have unprecedented levels of scarcity, continuous devaluations of the currency, and a yearly inflation rate topping 56%. In Maduro's Venezuela, you're also more likely to be kidnapped than in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Libya. Even active war zones and countries overrun by terrorists are safer than Venezuela. So the country was a veritable powder keg. It's ready to explode at any moment. Today's panelists are all experts on Venezuela, having either served for the U.S. government or the Venezuelan government, and continue to be champions for freedom in the Americas. The moderator for today's panel will be Mark Wachtenheim, a friend of democracy and a friend of the Heritage Foundation. Mark Wachtenheim is president of W International, and he's also president of the Center for Freedom and Democracy. Please join me in welcoming Mark.
Thanks, Ana, and thank you also to Heritage and to all of you for being here, and Heritage for hosting this important meeting at a time that Venezuela is living a pivotal moment in its history. The marches that began a few weeks ago, led by students throughout the country, have gained in numbers and in strength over the most recent days. The government has responded violently and aggressively, leaving at least 10 dead, 300 wounded, 100 imprisoned, and over 50 students still unaccounted for and missing. Venezuela, unfortunately, a long time ago went astray of the democratic path. And this is the crux of the issue at the heart of the matter. We've seen in Venezuela the use of tremendous oil resources of the state to extend monthly handouts and gifts to buy votes. but above all, the use of all the instruments of the state to crush and suppress legality and democratic principles, attacking the very spirit of democracy, while employing aggressive and insulting language, primitive and instinctive language, used to dehumanize and to psychologically delegitimize and crush its adversaries, all the while using the state resources of a fossilized economy, an economy that's no longer a living organism that attracts investment, that no longer generates productive employment for its people or builds capacity to be competitive on the global stage, that no longer invests in educating a population to be productive, or that's part of the global technological innovation, but instead an economy that relies solely on the liquid product of the fossils that God placed in Venezuela. A democratic system, on the other hand, requires and demands freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom of participation in the political system and of peaceful protest, freedom of access to information and a free media, free from state intervention, division of powers, and alternation of power so that power is not used as an instrument to stay in power through abuse and by using resources to buy support from the electorate. It's characterized by respect, by tolerance of differences, by tolerance of a plurality of views, and by calm and reasoned language, and by a climate of peaceful disagreement in which no one claims to possess the whole truth, but each works constructively together with those with whom one disagrees to find that truth. And this distinction isn't tangential to understanding the subject of today's meeting or the peaceful protests in Venezuela, but I would suggest it's fundamental to understanding them. And that's because the two sides of the struggle that's currently being waged in the streets of Venezuela represent two paths toward the future. One, a path of demagoguery, of populism, of authoritarianism, which leaves in its wake divided and destroyed nations. And the other, the path of freedom, of respect for the rule of law, of progress, and of modernity in a climate of peace. Increasingly, the Venezuelan people are not being fooled by the tropical siren song of a Caribbean version of pseudo-democratic populism. As President Lincoln said, you can fool all the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. What we're seeing is the strengthening of a movement that is not fooled and that reflects Venezuela's long-standing democratic and liberal spirit. And today, we're lucky enough to have a panel of experts who also have not been fooled and who've agreed to share with us some of their insights into what is taking place and to have agreed to answer some questions from the audience. So we're going to invite them to come to the podium and speak for 10 to 15 minutes, starting with Ambassador Otto Reich, who I'll now introduce. Ambassador Reich is the president of Otto Reich Associates, a consulting firm which advises U.S. and multinational clients on international government relations, trade and investment. And Ambassador Reich served as Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs under George W. Bush, and later went on to serve as President Bush's Special Envoy for Western Hemisphere Initiatives. In the 1980s, Ambassador Reich received 3 appointments from President Ronald Reagan, including Assistant Administrator for USAID, Special Advisor to the Secretary of State, and U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela. Ambassador Reich.
I'll just sit here. So easier. Well, thank you very much, Mark and Anna and Heritage for the invitation, and all of you for showing up on a rainy day. I'm not going to take time from my colleagues who are Venezuelan and who know more about the issue than I do. I will just give you my perspective of what is happening in Venezuela today. Try to address 3 things. What is happening in Venezuela today? What is the nature of the government, which I think explains what is happening or why it is happening. And third, what are the implications for U.S. policy, or what should we do? First, what is happening in Venezuela is a tragedy. It's a human tragedy. It is the strangulation, it's the killing of a young democracy in our neighborhood, with most of the neighbors, I'm ashamed to say, wringing their hands, watching while the democracy of Venezuela is being killed watching from behind their blinds, or some would say blindly watching. Pardon me. The aggressor, this is not an even fight between two groups of people, as some governments in the hemisphere who frankly favor the Venezuelan dictatorship have already said. This is not two groups of people fighting for power. This is an aggressor government. This is a brutal government that achieved power by deception, by trickery, was once elected, as we've seen governments all over the world once having been elected, Ukraine being one of them, for example, whose situation is very similar to what is happening today at a larger scale in Europe, and therefore getting more attention as it deserves, but I think so does Venezuela deserve the attention. The government is using all the force at its disposal to eliminate peaceful dissent. So far, there have been not a single incident where the government can accuse the opposition of using any weapons of any kind. The government is using uniformed services. It's using police. There are hundreds of videos now on the internet, on YouTube, that clearly show the human rights abuses being committed by the uniformed services and by organized groups of thugs called motorizados or tupamaros. They have all kinds of names that mostly ride motorcycles so they can run over people or beat them up or shoot them. Then the police come, finish beating them up, and in many cases leave them to die bleeding in the streets. That's the government of Venezuela. I'll talk a little bit more about the nature of the government of Venezuela. The government, by the way, it's important to say, is being aided. Venezuela is not only being aided, but in many cases, the repression is being directed by Cuban forces. There have been, it's been 15 years since the Cubans began arriving in force in Venezuela. They run strategic communications, they run military intelligence, civil intelligence. It is estimated there are over 50,000 Cubans in Venezuela. Some of them are teachers, some of them are doctors. Many of them are, for example, the private security, the security for the president of Venezuela, former President Chavez and the current president. They run the internal security apparatus, and they run it like they do in Cuba. No dissent. At the first sign of dissent, you cut off the head. That's the way that Castro stayed in power for 55 years, and if Maduro is allowed to do so, that's what will happen in Venezuela. The crisis came after 15 years of incredible economic mismanagement. Mismanagement is probably a nice term. Unprecedented corruption in a country where, frankly, corruption was a way of life, but where the corrupt, by and large, did not flaunt their wealth, their ill-gotten worth, like the Chavistas have. After 15 years of gradually eliminating all political freedoms, speech, press, assembly, enterprise, with very little attention from, and even fewer complaints from the rest of the world, the Venezuelan people got tired of it, and they have gone out in the streets to protest in the only way they can. What is happening is a popular insurrection, not unlike that in Kiev, but on a smaller scale. Smaller scale doesn't mean smaller human scale. The people who are dead in Venezuela are just as dead as the ones in Kiev. As I said, we tend to put more attention, to place more attention on our European scenarios because Americans tend to be European-oriented. It's historical and cultural and other reasons. But Venezuela is also, and Ukraine is a strategic country, and there's no question it is the obstacle to Vladimir Putin's strategy of rebuilding a Soviet empire under a Russian flag. But Venezuela is also a very strategic country. It is no coincidence that in the last 15 years, since the arrival of Hugo Chavez and the turning over, the gift of the Venezuelan national treasure to Cuba, you have seen countries like Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and others join a Cuban-Venezuelan orchestrated, designed alliance that is, whose common denominator is basically anti-Americanism. Venezuelan money has been discovered and exposed in practically every country in the hemisphere in elections, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Panama, in El Salvador. In some cases successfully, in some cases unsuccessfully. I think we're about to see another communist be elected president in El Salvador because the Salvadorian FMLN, the Marxist guerrillas who committed all kinds of atrocities in the 1970s and 80s, have now changed their face and they pretend to be Democrats, but they are getting money from Venezuela and outspending the democratic opposition by, I'm told, by Salvadorans as much as 20-1. That's Venezuelan money. Now, the importance of the Venezuelan oil also, it's most evident in Cuba. In the last 15 years, Venezuela has given Cuba about the same absolute amount of money, not relative, in absolute terms, as the Soviet Union gave to Cuba over 30 years, about $5 billion a year. Some experts estimate a lot more than that because a lot of it is hidden subsidies and hidden gifts from Venezuela to Cuba. That has provided life support to a government, the Cuban government, that was basically brain dead. Now, Cuba's returning the favor by directing this repression in Venezuela and making sure that the Venezuelan government stays in power. I said I was going to talk a little bit about the nature of the government of Venezuela. Who is this government? This is also part of the implications for U.S. policy. We tend to treat, the State Department tends to treat all governments pretty much as equal. At least they start out that way. They start out giving governments the benefit of the doubt. The Venezuelan government is about as normal a government in its own way as, say, North Korea or Syria or others. Again, differences in scale. The Venezuelan government is not normal any more than dealing with and trying to deal with a Venezuelan government would be, by diplomatic means, would be as erroneous as trying to deal with an organized crime enterprise, a RICO enterprise, an organized crime state by diplomatic means. Why do I say it's an organized crime state? The Venezuelan government and many others in the region and others around the world, and I would include even Russia to some degree, there are a lot of authoritarian governments whose purpose it is not to raise the standards of living of the people, provide more safety and security and economic opportunity, but to stay in power for the sake of power and to make the people in power, the elites, the party, the military, the security forces, the apparatchiks, make them as rich as possible, as wealthy as possible. Putin and Igor Sechin and Maduro and Chavez before him and all the people around the various power centers in Venezuela today. There are billionaires, people who were a lieutenant in the Venezuelan army not too long ago. One was just found in West Palm Beach, Florida, a guy who was a lieutenant who helped to launch the coup, an unconstitutional, bloody coup with Chavez in 1992. His name is Andrade. Was estimated to be worth over $1.5 billion, had bought a multi-million-dollar mansion, airplanes, yachts, horses. He was living here very, very comfortably because this is a country ruled by law. So we have safety and security and transparency, and that's what he wanted after having destroyed all that in Venezuela. Fortunately, he was found out. We canceled the visa. He left. There are a lot of others. There are hundreds of Venezuelans with ill-gotten money living in the United States today, spending their money here, enjoying our safety and security and our rule of law. I'll get to that at the end about very quickly what we can do about it. Just an illustration of what I mean by the Venezuelan government is an organized crime organization. The U.S. Treasury Department, which is very slow and prodding and methodical and careful in the way that it accuses people of anything, has designated several top Venezuelan ministers and generals as drug kingpins. A drug kingpin is not just the guy who sells drug on the corner. These are people who do not just tolerate narcotics trafficking in Venezuela. They have been found to be directing and benefiting from narcotics trafficking, and that's why so many of them are billionaires. The equivalent ranks of some of those ministers and generals from the Venezuelan government that have been designated drug kingpins by our government are Secretary of Defense, Head of National Intelligence, meaning CIA and FBI combined, head of military intelligence, or say the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency in the United States, Secretary of Homeland Security, for example, equivalent, military chiefs like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's the Venezuelan government. So it doesn't make any sense for the United States to try to deal diplomatically with a country like that. I've said jokingly that the person we need to put in charge of our diplomacy to deal with these people is somebody like Rudy Giuliani. And not so joking, because they are a mafia and they have to be dealt with as a mafia. So what do we do? So I don't take up the whole, how can you deal with it? In the specific case of Venezuela, a lot of people say, oh, we can't impose sanctions. Well, it's interesting. The EU has just decided to impose sanctions on the Ukrainian government. And if it's good enough for the EU and if it's good enough for Ukraine, I don't understand why it's not good enough for Venezuela. But let's say that you don't want to impose sanctions because you're afraid to hurt the entire population. All you have to do is make a list of the people we know. And I know we know. I've been inside the government. We know who the hundreds of Venezuelans are who have benefited from this kleptocracy, from this massive corruption, and who are who are ordering these killings and the tortures, and who are delivering Venezuela into the hands of a hostile government that's on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and that's Cuba. Take those people and simply deny their visas to the United States. A lot of Americans don't understand how important it is to deny to people, to the bad guys in Latin America, the privilege of coming to the United States. Every Friday, I have an office in Miami. A Venezuelan told me, he says, all you have to do every Friday, go to Opa-locka Airport or go to Tamiami or go to Miami International, you'll see all the Venezuelan planes coming in with the families, and in some cases, the very ministers and others, they're coming in for the weekend to spend their hundreds of millions of dollars that they have gotten illegally in their own country. They have looted their own country, and they're coming here to spend it because we have allowed them to have visas into the United States. How many of us would allow the head of the local mafia to come into our living rooms? That's what we're doing. So if we don't want to impose economic sanctions, just identify the kingpins of the violence and of the corruption and of the subversion and take away their visas. Let me just stop there.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Reich, and I hope that we'll have some time at the end to further explore some of the very interesting topics that you raised so eloquently, including a parallel with what's taking place today in Ukraine, where the eyes of the world are focused on that situation, and reminding us that the value of a life lost there is equivalent to the value of lives lost by Venezuelans. And next, we have with us Leopoldo Martinez, who is the president of the Center for Democracy and Development in the Americas. He's also the representative of the Democratic Unity Roundtable, or MUD, Mesa de Unidad Democrática, and a former congressman in Venezuela. Leopoldo?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation and everybody for taking the time, and I'm honored to be in a panel with my friend Otto Reich, a man we know in Venezuela very well for his days as a good ambassador, and Beatriz, who probably got me involved in politics at some point in my life. I'm going to give you 6 numbers for you to take on your notes. 57%. That's the rate of annual inflation in Venezuela. It's the highest in the Americas. 27,000. That's the number of people who are killed in homicides in the cities and towns of Venezuela every year. 28%. That's the scarcity index, measuring the shortages of basic foods that are part of the what we call canasta básica, which is the basic goods and services that the Venezuelans need every time they go to the supermarket or the groceries. It means that a Venezuelan has to make 3, 4, or 5 rounds to find 100% of what they need to make ends meet. I'm talking about sugar, I'm talking about salt, I'm talking about oil or flour or a protein, whether it's fish, chicken, or beef. 18,000% is the accumulated rate of devaluation over the past 15 years in Venezuela. And 100% is the last devaluation that took place this same year, we're talking, 2014, when the government decided to narrow the number of products that are eligible to be imported through the official control exchange rate and move them to what they call the SICAD, which is another official, a second rate, which is you get access to it through a bidding process every day in the market, which is at almost $12, 12 bolívares per dollar. So in a month, this went up from 6 to 12. It's 100%. Now think about those numbers and ask yourself, how in the world do you expect that students, households, women, moms, dads, anybody could at any point in every hour we are sitting in this room be tempted to go onto the streets and say something about what's going on? Now, I'm going to give you another number, 100. $100 per barrel is the average price of oil over the past few years, steadily, in the international markets. It's the first time in Venezuelan history that an oil bonanza is not associated with high growth, low inflation, and progress. That is a question that nobody in the government of Venezuela has been able to respond. So the people of Venezuela had not been able to find answers through their governments. They are doing everything they can, pacifically, like no other people in the continent or in the world, by going on and on to elections, by participating day by day in different forms of expression of their dissent. That is the context, my dear friends, in which we have to see what's going on in Venezuela today. Then we have to, I'm going to give you 5 events that you need to make note of to understand exactly where we're standing right now. April 14th, April 14th, 2013. January 23 this year. And the third, not 4, the third, I'm sorry, is 12th of February this year. April 14th was the day in which handpicked Nicolás Maduro faced Enrique Capriles in a national presidential election, a special national presidential election. Enrique Capriles won that election. The government claims they won that election for a 1% margin. That can happen in many places in the world, in many democracies in the world. Enrique Capriles has given testimony on that very particular event of the very pacific and institutional nature of Venezuela's opposition. He withheld the people from doing anything that could drag the country into violence. Much to the regret of several in Venezuela, he did that. He exercised and used all the political capital an individual can have to say, we're going to refrain from generating any event that the government could use to fire this country into violence. And we're going to use the institutional channels to protest this election, and you guys are going to follow me. And we did. And we did that peacefully for the last few months. Enrique Capriles took, and the Mesa de Unidad Democrática elevated as well, their complaint to the authorities, electoral authorities in Venezuela, which without a look into the paperwork, inadmitted, dismissed the claims, opening the international opportunity of challenging the election at another level, which Enrique Capriles did. We brought the case to the Commission, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and we took the case to the United Nations. So here is the face of an opposition, the picture of an opposition that wins an election and yet decides with a government that has the nature described in this context by Otto Reich, and that has to go through the numbers I'm giving you, the disaster they have to live every day. This is the nature of a people and a leadership that says, we're yet going to do this pacifically. You can be more, what would be the term, Gandanian than that? Or, I mean, what do we have to do to show some in the Americas who owe their own democracies today to the efforts of the Venezuelan Democrats of the 60s and the 70s to look into this and say, we are facing a decent, peaceful, democratic group of individuals trying to make their best of their country without resorting to violence and opening the door to every form of dialogue. On December 8th, we went to an election, a municipal election, in which we had our gains and our losses. The popular vote indicates some numbers, but the number of mayors that the opposition has in its hands increased from 65 to 90, including the principal capitals of the country. One very important and symbolic, the capital of Barinas, the very homeland of President Chavez. So it wasn't a loss for us. We went to win mayorships, and we win more mayorships. Yet the government was deaf about that until they realized that they had to enter into a dialogue with the opposition. And we went. We went. Not only the mayors and the governors, but Enrique Capriles himself. Why did he go to speak with Nicolás Maduro? With much regret by so many in the opposition that could not understand why he went. He went because on those days, Monica Spears, one of the beloved actresses of Venezuelan people, was killed in a terrible crime. This is a woman that has her life made in the international media. Her husband is a British origin person. They have a 5-year-old daughter. They're both living outside of Venezuela, yet they decided that they will take their little girl to know her roots and travel around Venezuela. See the beauty of this. A British man and a Venezuelan that has accomplished everything internationally says, I want to take my daughter to spend these days of December knowing their cousins, knowing her land, going back to her roots, wishing that that could be back again the land of her daughter. She gets killed, he gets killed. The country goes, of course, in indignation, and Capriles said, we need to speak about security in this country. And yet, Maduro accepted to speak about security without any specifics in policy as we speak, so he went to talk with him. This is the nature of the leadership that Venezuela has in front of the opposition. Then I spoke about January 23rd. That's the day we celebrate our democracy. During those days, the Serie del Caribe, the Caribbean series, were being played in Venezuela. Baseball, the Caribbean series is for us in Venezuela, Major League Baseball. And we play good baseball, by the way. You just have to look at the Major League rosters to see how many good Venezuelans you have there playing. We're about the best. I probably think we are the best. But you know, the Cubans are also very good. My friends from Cuba know that well. And that was the rivalry in the past. And we haven't had Cuba for years playing And it was decided that it will rejoin the series. I love to see that because I love to see Venezuela playing against the Cubans. So, I mean, taking any considerations about politics, I love to see them playing baseball because I love baseball. So this happens, and a few students go to the event where the Cubans are going to play. And they go on and express their discontent for having Cuban presence, not the athletes, Cuban presence, government presence inside Venezuela in the nature or with the characteristics that Otto has described. And through that dissent, some of them go to jail. Some of them get arrested. So what happens is that the solidarity of the students in Táchira and Mérida comes forward. They say, hey, they put our guys in prison up there in Margarita. Why did they do that? We want them free. And they start to go up to the streets saying, free them, make changes in the country. We're not tolerating the homicides. We're not tolerating the economy. We don't have jobs. And here we are, February 12th. The students go back to the streets. They go peacefully out, and they get brutally repressed. Where is the violence coming from? After I've just said this. The violence is coming from, fundamentally, what is known in Venezuela as the colectivos. And the repression, it's coming from the official forces of the government, the brutality. The violence of the colectivos happens inside the perimeters of security that the National Police and the National Guard creates when they are safeguarding the area where manifestations are taking place. So think about this. Guys come in and out, armed in motorcycle, of the perimeter of security created by the official National Guard and the police, without nobody stopping them when they come in or when they come out. And they kill people, they hit people, they shoot at buildings, they come inside buildings. We're going to see images about that at some point in the conference. Who are the colectivos? The colectivos are armed and sponsored groups to defend the revolution and to do and organize the revolutionaries of the shanty towns in Caracas around the political propositions of the government. They are armed, and they are, in the words of President Maduro, while these events that we will see later on tape were taking place in the city of Caracas, these armed and trained individuals harassing, killing, or intimidating people around the city, while they were doing this in a mandatory national broadcast, which we defined as cadenas in Venezuela, President Maduro said that he would not tolerate the stigma against the colectivos because these were, I'm going to use these words, hardworking, revolutionary people. What's another element that you have to think when you listen about the colectivos? These are Cuban-trained groups. This is where the Cubans operate, really, in this area. And they are part of a terrible situation that we have in Venezuela, which is a revolving door between the judicial institutions, the prisons, and society. The prisons in Venezuela are controlled by a mafia called or named themselves as the Pranes. And the Pranes do not allow the official government to come in the prisons. It's their sanctuary. They dictate. They even dictate who comes and who won't come into a prison. There's an interesting thing. After the killing of Monica Spears and her husband, the government rapidly, immediately, with an efficiency unseen before, got the criminals. And these people were not allowed to go into a particular prison because the Pranes there said that those were not the guys who killed Monica Spears, that they know who did it. And they couldn't put them in that prison. So who rules the prisons? These people. So this revolving door makes or allows that anybody who commits a crime in the streets, even if he is tried in court and sent to prison, he'll come out anytime and do another crime. And they come in and they come out, and they come in and they come out. So we're talking about an operation, a sophisticated operation of organized crime. I'm going to share documents with this audience today of the balance that we have in the mood of human rights violations, with names, ID numbers, and situation of each of the cases, so that you can share and advocate with every human rights activist or organization you know. These are names, family members, sons and daughters of Venezuelans that you're going to see there that are either detained, subject to trial, and there's some cases of torture there as well. We have now Leopoldo Lopez, one of the key figures of the opposition in Venezuela, and you're going to have a document that I will distribute with all the violations of the process that took place during his charges and arrest and all the events surrounding his surrender to the authorities. Significant numbers of due process issues and all that information that you're going to see. And I'm going to just mention in the last few minutes I have to finish the cases of a media blockout that we have in Venezuela. The government had a strategy to buy out the media. They decided not to knock anybody else down like they did with Radio Caracas Televisión in the past. They decided to buy out the media. And they are buying media. They're using friends of the government to buy out the media. Now, the international media plays a role. CNN and NTN 24, as we speak, had been taken out of the cable system in Venezuela. And there has been a very interesting fact, a rebellion of the staff of these co-opted media, like in Últimas Noticias, who are telling what they are seeing. They're disrespecting the editorial line of their new owners to say what they see, because they can't resist anymore to document and talk about the violations, particularly the human rights violations. What are the MOODS initiatives? And these are my last seconds to finish. The MOOD has issued a statement, which we're sharing today with you. Two statements, one in regards to Leopoldo Lopez and the detainees, one in regards to what we believe needs to happen in the country. We are talking about a refocusing of the protests. We are going to continue to mobilize the Venezuelan people, but we're going to do it in an organized way. We don't want to have a conflict. We don't want to create a short circuit in communications between the majority of the Venezuelan people and the protests. We have monitored every protest in Venezuela. In 2013, we have 5,000 protests in Venezuela, of which more than 60% were protagonized by pro-Chavista movements. So we don't want to push them out of our coalition. We want to bring them in. So we want to keep our communication, our message focused on the issues. And we are approaching the international community in different fronts, promoting among different ideas the constitution, the institution of a commission of group that we could define as a group of friends of Venezuela that could come in, including the Catholic Church, if it's a sufficient guarantee for the government of our intentions, and try to mediate on a significant number of conditions that we think are necessary to reestablish the rule of law and democracy, and a playground under which we can peacefully resolve our dissents over the next few months and years in Venezuela. We are doing this with every disposition to dialogue. We're doing this with every disposition to keep it peaceful, and we're doing this with every commitment to the institutional framework that we have both in the international community and inside of Venezuela. We are not asking any country to take any unilateral action or any sanction. We are asking every country of the Organization of American States to take a leadership position and influence within the OAS to make it possible that the democratic charter is applied in some way, in some fashion, in the case of Venezuela, which could be through a group of friends of Venezuela, including influential former presidents that are, they could be anyone. If they want to choose three former Latin American presidents who are friends of Maduro, we welcome that to happen, as long as they are Democrats, of course, people committed to values, rule of law, and democracy. So this is where we're standing, and I would be, of course, open to your questions if you want to understand more about our strategy, where we're going, and what we're thinking that could happen over the next few days and months in Venezuela. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leopoldo. And we will have a chance to field some of your questions, but in order to do that, I'd like to ask our next speaker. We're very lucky to have her here, who traveled here from Miami to be on this panel, Beatriz Rangel. If we could limit, please, your remarks to 10 minutes, and then we'll allow a little bit more time for question and answer, because one of our panelists will have to leave before the event ends. Beatriz Rangel is an accomplished international business executive in Latin America and the Caribbean. She served as a minister of the Secretariat under Venezuelan President Carlos Andrés Pérez, chief strategist for the Cisneros Group of Companies, and institutional relations director for CODERE. Ms. Rangel is currently the managing director for AMLA Consulting Group. Beatriz.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I must say that I'm honored, and I thank the Heritage Foundation for this opportunity to discuss what is going on in Venezuela in the company of such a distinguished panel as Ambassador Otto Reich and, of course, Leopoldo, whose virtues I claim, whose defects I don't know. So,
That's true.
Well, before really, I will beg your indulgence before I start discussing this matter, because I must confess, and this is a disclosure, that I'm deeply affected by what is going on in Venezuela, because over the last 24 hours, the houses of members of my family have been assaulted by the government forces, and every hour I get new and new notices of harassment to people in my family. Therefore, I'll try to be as impartial as possible, but truly speaking, what I have seen and feeling is that there is a bunch of talks going after the civic leaders and student leaders, like is the case of my nephews. Venezuela was described by Rómulo Gallegos, a distinguished novelist and a civic leader, as a country that was white and unclaimed. He referred to this vast expanse of virgin lands and yet unpossessed by citizens. And what we see today, with tears, is that Venezuela is again unpossessed by its citizens. But now, because it is ruled by a foreign colonial power that is draining away Venezuela's resources and lifeblood with total disregard for its sovereignty and the welfare of the Venezuelan people. This happened after a period of continuing institutional decay from the late 1980s to the late 1990s, precipitating a political tsunami that stopped short all the efforts at reform and renewal and created the conditions for a totalitarian regime enthralled to the Cuban Revolution. In signing over Venezuela's national political and economic birthrights to the Castro brothers, President Chavez converted a whole people into orphans, dispossessed in their own land. The Cuban colonization is now being consolidated by eviscerating the middle class and its political leaders, abetted by government-controlled thugs, and using student protests to justify the imposition of autocracy of the Cuban model and proceed with a military technique that reminds of the Night of the Pencils that was used by the Argentinian army when in that dreadful period of their history called the Process. There is another thing that characterizes Venezuela besides being ruled by a colonial power. The economy is in a steady decline with a foreseeable brutal collapse in the near or medium term. Presidents Maduro and Chavez before him have asphyxiated the private sector, national production of food and consumer goods has effectively been destroyed, and the government of Venezuela seeks total control of all aspects of national life. Argentina, at least, is now acknowledging that the commodity boom is over and that adjustments are necessary. But President Maduro, with singular lack of insight or awareness, is making no adjustment at all. Instead, he's doubling down on his populism. High oil prices over the last decade lifted the regime and financed populist spending, also penetrating other democracies in Latin America to create even a more horrendous system of control that goes beyond the Venezuelan borders. But investment in Venezuela, generally, and above all, in maintenance of the oil sector has gone to zero. Oil production in December was 2.45 million barrels per day, and is declining steadily from a high of 4 million when President Chavez came to power. It could go well beyond 2 million barrels per day within a year. Of that, about 1/3 is for domestic consumption, while much of the rest goes to pay China for loans that the government of Venezuela spent already in consumption. At some point, the government of Venezuela, whose liquid reserves are running low, will run out of money, and it will go into economic and financial collapse. This economic and financial collapse will, of course, cause political dissent, and this is what they're preparing for, a brutal repression in order to be able to continue their rule. In the meantime, the Venezuelan oil and financial support is critical to Cuba, as it contributes, imagine this, 15% of the Cuban GDP comes from Venezuela. So they're going to fight tooth and nail to continue to hold on to the government of Venezuela. Of Venezuela's financial reserves, which were or are supposed to be 21 billion in operative and non-operative reserve, so significant portion of its goals, it is estimated about 60% is, or about 14 billion are in Cuba. Cubans exercise close oversight and control over vital parts of the oil and financial sector. The head offices of PDVSA Finances, which is the national oil company, and some banks are now in Havana in the state of Caracas. And without Venezuela, Cuba would experience another special period, as it did when the Soviet Union collapsed. And therefore, controlling Venezuela is a question of life and death for the ruling elite in Cuba. We are witnessing a Caribbean Anschluss, which is very funny because the only Anschluss what we have in the history was Germany with Austria. But this is like Austria had taken over Germany, because we are talking about a country that has 30 million people and being taken over by one that has 10 million people. We have between 35 and 45,000 Cubans in Venezuela. And they're running the government officers, they're running the intelligence service, and worst of all, they're running all the public financial institutions. Having ruined their economy, of course, and including destroying their middle class, the Cubans are now doing the same in Venezuela. From a high of about 28% of the population, middle class consumption levels now prevail for barely 6 to 8% of Venezuelans people. So we went from 28% to 6 to 8%. And these statistics are not reliable because nothing is reliable anymore in Venezuela. Recent developments include that there is an almost total blackout of news out of Venezuela. But we can't know what the outlines of what is going on are very clear and reveal where this government is going to go. First of all, whatever you hear, the conditions of scarcity and inflation, they are much worse in the provinces than in Caracas. This explains why the student protests started in the provinces and then went into Caracas. People who are in the provinces, if the number gave by Leopoldo, that 28% is with the people of Caracas. Mm-hmm. The people in the provinces, your number is 35%.
That's correct.
Which means that you have to go and grab whatever there is in the supermarkets in the hope that when you get home, then you will be able to exchange things that you don't need for things that you need with somebody who was lucky enough to go and grab them. And gasoline is scarce, everything is scarce, and so very many cities in the interior of Venezuela are virtually paralyzed. And under the current circumstances, of course, our youth feels that there is no future for them, and this is why they took it to the streets. The robbing bands of government thoughts, which are the colectivos very well described by Leopoldo, I'm not going to describe them, to elaborate on what he already said, but if they have been terrorizing the people in Caracas, they are of total control of the cities in the interior of Venezuela. And this all began with a student march that was pretended to celebrate the participation of our youth in the independence wars. The students were protesting. What were they protesting? Insecurity, because it already has been said here that Venezuela has the highest homicide rate in the world. Shortages of food and basic goods, and an accelerating inflation of 56%. They were attacked brutally by these colectivos, while Maduro said that the students and their leaders were fascists bent on a coup d'etat and that he would exterminate the enemies of democracy. I want to tell you, if you analyze the totalitarian regimes throughout history, this is how they operate. Maduro was just following a script that has been written a long time ago. It happened in Prague in '68. It has happened everywhere in the world. They come and they denounce a conspiration, and they ground this in on an event that is minor in order to justify their repression. And this is exactly what Maduro did. He followed perfectly the script, and in this script, of course, written by the Cubans. It is a supreme irony that the greatest support letter that Maduro has received was from President Bashar al-Assad from Syria, who described what Maduro is going through is that he was facing a brutal attack on him and the will of the Venezuelan people. Mr. Assad must know a lot of what the will of the Syrian people is. And in listening to this official statement, one remembers that the rule that one says, that rule that says that when somebody talks about somebody else, what he's really talking is about him or herself. In closing observations, I think, my closing observation I would say that I don't think that the regime will survive an eventual economic collapse. But I don't know when will exactly occur, and if without an international intermediation to restitute, to get away, to do away with violence, and incentivize dialogue in Venezuela, what we're going to see is a lot of people dead. A massacre before this regime, the rules, the invisible hand of economics brings down the economy of Venezuela, and of course with it the regime. In the meantime, Venezuela's middle class is politically and economically crushed in a campaign supported by the Cuban regime, which is desperate to prolong its existence, but which is very nearsighted in taking no action to keep the golden goose of the Venezuelan oil industry alive. I would like to suggest as what is it that we need to do, because I wouldn't like you to leave without thinking that we don't know what would be good for Venezuela. We don't think it would be good for Venezuela to come with embargoes and anything of that nature, because that will create even more and more pain among the Venezuelan people. But worse than that, it will give the moral authority and justification to this repressive regime that in order to kill more people in Venezuela. What we need to do is, I welcome very much what Ambassador Reich said. You have to place the guilt on the people who are perpetrating this massacre. And you have to withdraw the visas. This is very good. And we should use in a more intelligent way, we the Americans, we should use in a more intelligent way the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. it is an instrument that allows us to withhold assets, to suppress bank accounts, and to do a lot of things that the United States wanted to be done to the service of transparency in conducting business. But this time, you need to use it to fight a bunch of thugs that have taken a government before, a long time ago, very months ago, a democratic society, and are using the resources of oil of that democratic society, not only to suppress the people of Venezuela, but also in order to create a mirror image regimes in other places of our hemisphere. And therefore, I think the dialogue, but in order for the dialogue to start, you need to have some levers of pressure. Those described by Ambassador Reich are very good. And I also think that withdrawal of visas, using of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in an intelligent way. And then, of course, I don't know if the Catholic Church, but definitely the Vatican, to get involved in getting a dialogue going in Venezuela, and let the Vatican be the one that gathers the friends and acts with the Truth Commission and goes on. But the first thing that we need to ask to that government is that give us an account of the students that are arrested, that they have to respond for their physical integrity, and that they have, Mr. Lopez needs to have his due process respected. And with those things, I think we could start turning things around in Venezuela. And with these ideas, I leave you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk to you.
And thank you, Adriana. And by Mr. Lopez, of course, you mean Leopoldo Lopez, one of the leaders of the opposition who was imprisoned a couple of days ago, and I believe already has had trumped-up charges filed against him. As you formulate questions, and please, we'd like to field a few questions from the audience, if we could put the PowerPoint presentation up, please, so that, Beatriz, we'd like to ask you to talk about a few of the slides on this presentation. But while they're doing that, I'd like to open up the floor for questions. Ambassador Reich has to leave us early, so if there are any questions particularly for him, perhaps those can come first. If you could, just introduce yourself first.
Terry Miller, I'm with the Heritage Foundation. I'm the editor of the Index of Economic Freedom and a former State Department official. The political left around the world has shown, and certainly in Latin America and right here in the United States, have shown an appalling tendency to excuse repression, political or economic repression by regimes. Certainly Cuba, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, El Salvador. There's a whole long range you could name. As long as it's dressed up with a little veneer of anti-Americanism, and I'm afraid that this sort of romanticized view of these political strongmen in Latin America may even infect our current administration, political leadership here in the United States. And I was wondering if you believe that's true, and if so, what the possibilities are for the U.S. to take effective and constructive action at this time against a regime like Venezuela or Cuba. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you want to take one or two more against them all, but okay, you're absolutely right about the bias of the press. Already, for example, Leopoldo Lopez, who is a Harvard-educated elected mayor of the biggest district in Venezuela, and one of the biggest, and who's never been violent in his life, has been described by Associated Press, Agence France Press, and others as the hardline, aristocratic Lopez, who is leading demonstrations that have turned violent against the elected government the democratic government, or whatever. I mean, I'm emphasizing some of these adjectives that they use, and these are two or two or three news organizations that have a reputation for objectivity, unearned in my view, and when it comes to Latin America. The kind of reporting that passes for acceptable in Latin America would never be accepted in the United States or Europe by most Europeans if it dealt with Europe. That's okay because, you know, we're dealing with those you know, those little brown people as they see them, frankly. A lot of these liberals see them, and this was written in a book by a Venezuelan, Carlos Rangel, 30 years ago, almost 40 years ago, Del Buen Salvaje al Buen Revolucionario, from the noble savage to the noble revolutionary. They see, a lot of our liberals and the Europeans see these people like Maduro and Castro and the others and Che Guevara. You know, it's really too bad that they have to kill a few 100,000 people because after all, they're trying to bring good things. And if they fail at bringing those good things, we have to recognize that they meant well. Okay, now what do we do? I don't want you to think that I'm cynical about this. It's just a result. It's only the result of, you know, of 45 years of dealing in Latin America. What the United States should do, and I think, frankly, your question goes to, in some way, to the Obama foreign policy. I mean, I think, and I don't want to turn this into a domestic electoral or political debate, although I'm very happy to. This shows Venezuela and Ukraine and others show the failure of constructive engagement as articulated very well, because the president is a very articulate person, by the president in the campaign of 2008 and subsequently, when he said that we should never fear to sit down and negotiate with our enemies. And in fact, that's what we should do. Well, how well did that policy work out for you, Mr. President, in North Korea, in Iran, in Syria, in Libya, in Cuba, in Venezuela? There's not a single success. Iran, the book is not quite closed yet, although if you ask 59 bipartisan members of the U.S. Senate, they have closed the book pretty much on those conversations, but not being a senator, I won't speak for them. The world is not the way we want it to be. I wish it were. The world is full of people like Assad, like Chavez, like Castro, like Mao, like Stalin, like Hitler, who are perfectly willing to kill by the millions to advance their ideology. And in the last 75 years, only one nation has stood in the way of those people, and that's the United States. And we haven't stood in the way of them only by diplomacy. There's a role for diplomacy in the world, and I have to confess that at times I've had to be diplomatic, but only as a last resort. I mean, diplomacy is an instrument of national policy, but it does, as I said, it doesn't work with certain people. Has it worked with Assad? How many people has he killed? And he's perfectly willing to kill everybody outside of his ruling circle if necessary. The same as Castro. The same as you know, the African rulers. And it's not ideological. They can be right, left, center, completely non-ideological. Idi Amin, what ideology did he have? We have to recognize the fact that these are not good people. Just like we accept the fact that we need police in our neighborhoods, in our cities, because there are bad people who are willing to pick our pockets or stab us to death. And it's the same thing in the rest of the world. That's why if a nation's policy, diplomacy, is not backed up by force, I'm sorry, I know this is probably not very popular in some circles, in some drawing rooms in Washington. If it's not backed up by force, it is a failure. Thank you. My sister here. I apologize. I have an interview to go to, but thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, David. Well, please help me in thanking Ambassador Reich. Before we move to the next series of questions, Beatriz, would you mind please explaining, because the subject of the panel discussion today, again, is to, understanding the protests that are taking place right now in Venezuela. We had, I think, an excellent presentations on the context that gives rise to those protests and something about what's actually taking place, but if we can steer it back to what's going on the ground.
Yeah. Well, this is San Cristobal, the capital city of the Táchira state, where there was the first protest staged by the students. San Cristobal has a very important historical weight in Venezuelan history, because it was from that city that a whole bunch of Andeans, as they call them in Venezuela, marched towards Caracas and got it together when Venezuela was separated by a lot of caudillos that were fighting among themselves and was threatened with disappearance. So this group of Andeans marched over Caracas, conquered Caracas, and established a regime that lasted for about almost 70 years. Because of that political significance, the government reacted terribly and decided we are going to crush this, because it can't have if they followed a leader kind of reaction. And they chose, this is where they are applying what we call the night of the pencils. That's how it's called, named by the Argentinian forces. They go, they compartmentalize the city in different blocks, and then they take over one by one, they burn in order to force people to get out of the houses, and when they are outside, they either take them, they arrest them, or they kill them. And this is what this picture is showing: the deployment of the Night of the Pencils military strategy for repression in San Cristobal. This is the march that unleashed the Night of the Pencils. As you can see, nobody has handguns or any weapons. The only weapons that they have is a Venezuelan flag. The only thing that makes it threatening is how massive it is and how many people came. I think that even to the students, it took them by surprise that they have such a clear capacity to convey so many people to their marches. It was supposed to be just a student march with just the different representatives from universities and high schools attending. And these are the Russian airplanes that were used to threaten and terrorize the people of San Cristobal in Táchira. These are warplanes, and they flew them very low so that the people would get scared and start getting out of their houses.
Could you, as we prepare for the next series of questions, please raise your hands and we'll have a mic go over to you. And just please introduce yourselves, and if we can keep questions brief, then we'll be able to get to more of them. But to kick it off, could you give us a sense of the scale in terms of numbers, the number of cities, number of people involved in these marches, what's happening? We know that they've been growing over the last couple of weeks. Do we know what's happening today, what the plan is going forward? Mm-hmm. And what's the composition of the protesters? We know it started as students, but then others from civil society and regular people have joined. If you could give us an idea of who they are, I think that would be helpful.
But what I gather as today is that, but for Táchira and eventually in Valencia, another important city in Venezuela, the face of what you saw in the pictures as those manifestations of people marching in the streets change to more of a focalized protests where Táchira is, San Cristobal is one of the places that is more heated, I would say, today. The students continue to show their willingness to go out, and the people in general continue to show their willingness to protest. But the leaders in the opposition, given the facts, are trying to refocus or rechannel the way these protests are being held by calling for another manifestation this coming Saturday, which is going to be peaceful, pacific, just like the ones that you saw at the very beginning, and try to move the energies of the people towards a more organized, issue-demanding, and well-oriented, message-driven form of protest. Because we want to stay away from the claim that we are somehow participating in the violence that the violent spiral that the government wants to somehow create and attribute to the government. So we're going to see, I think, over the next few days, a turnaround on what has happened over the last 2 days or 3 days to another situation that's going to be a more, I would say, focused and organized, and I hope it will, form of manifestation. There is always, and the Russians always play also, like they say in the playbook, no? There is always the government trying to provoke something different. So there's a lot of things they do just to trigger reactions from certain sectors of society, and we are calling everyone in Venezuela to stay away from temptation, stay away from provocation, stay away from, for instance, the issue of closing streets within their own neighborhoods and that kind of things, which normally are creating more trouble to our own mayors than to the government. The mayor of Chacao, the mayor of Baruta are dealing with a number of security and governance issues that we don't want them to have. If we want to show the government how angry we are with them, we don't want to create a problem to my dear friend Gerardo Blay or my dear friend Ramon Muchacho in running their municipalities. So I think there's going to be a transformational process in this. It's not going to stop. And it's not going to stop because these are organic manifestations. The context I gave you with the numbers, Beatriz explained very well. And I would say that until and unless the government of Nicolás Maduro is willing to show that they will commit to serious dialogue and to serious rectification and to show some signs of institutional guarantees for the opposition, this is going to continue. And there are 3 or 4 events that I think we have to keep an eye on. And these form part of the demands that the opposition has consistently put in the table as potential dialogue issues. A number of judges of the Supreme Court have already their mandates expired, and there need to be hearings in Congress following procedures with a qualified majority to designate new members of the Supreme Court. Of course, the government does not have today, unless they keep impeaching the immunity and taking to jail our Congress people, which they continue to show the willingness to do. I have to mention that, for instance, Maria Corina Machado is threatened by an impeachment as we speak also. Unless they do something like that and continue to narrow our numbers through that process, they don't have the 2/3 that they need to accumulate in a vote to designate a justice. The Consejo Nacional Electoral, which is the National Electoral Authority, also have their mandates expired, and they need to be redesignated, and a special qualified majority is necessary. So there's only one way that could be done to ensure some guarantees, democratic guarantees to the opposition, and all we're saying is let's engage in those processes so that we can come out with at least those designations. The controller of the nation also is due for designation because of the passing of the former controller of the nation. The one in office right now is a deputy controller of the nation. So we're saying those are three key institutional figures of the essential to separation of powers that we can go on and designate in a way that you will vote and we will vote, and whenever we get the 2/3, we get some people that could create a balance in the institutions. We're not asking for Maduro, but this is not about the opposition asking for the president to leave. This is very important, and I want to convey this message clearly in this instance. We are not demanding the president to leave. We have challenged his election, and we expect that to be decided at some point. And we're going to press and keep pressing until that is decided. We are not doing anything outside the Constitution, and we won't. It is essential to the Mesa de Unidad Democrática to stay within the framework of the Constitution. And it is very interesting that we are seeing the opposition embracing the Constitution every day more and more, and Maduro detaching himself from the Constitution.
Exactly.
Which is a very interesting process, because they always claim that we are working on the sides of the Constitution. And I think there's a very important historical event that you all need to keep in your minds to understand the nature of the mood and where the mood is headed. The first important political victory of the Mesa de Unidad Democrática was the day we won the referendum to reform the Constitution. We defeated Chavez in his attempt to reform the Constitution. And till that day, that Constitution that was approved by them and with their votes, because when that Constitution was approved after the National Constitutional Assembly, the opposition rallied in the elections on the referendum with the no. We didn't want that Constitution. And it was from 1999 till 2006, 2007, when we held the national referendum to reform the Constitution, that we, the people who said we didn't want that Constitution in 2007, went out to say we now want that Constitution. So that was the day in which the 100% of the people of Venezuela took in their hands the Constitution that was given by Chavez himself. So who is betraying the legacy? If the legacy is embodied in that Constitution, who is betraying the legacy? Because we embrace that Constitution and we want to do it through that Constitution, not outside of that Constitution. We have said once, twice, and 1,000,000 times that what's good for all of us is the Constitution of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. And we want to make that very clear, that the manifestations cannot be about anything different than enforcing the rule of law and the Constitution in Venezuela.
I know that there were a couple of other hands up. Maybe we can take several questions at once. Sir?
Sure. Thank you. My name is Manfred Schweitzer. I have a company called Polestar Consulting, and I used to be in the State Department myself. I want to ask something of a little bit of a challenging question. It goes a little bit to what you were talking about in constitutionality, and most especially of Leopoldo. It's two parts. First of all, well, I'm very curious to know why Maduro became president, even though the Constitution that you just cited said he shouldn't have become president. It was Diosdado Cabello to become president. And Diosdado Cabello is a far more able, canny, ruthless, effective politician than Maduro is, who really is, you have to admit, quite helpless, incompetent, and even something of a buffoon in the haplessness of things that happened to him. And I wonder why that happened. I suspect it might be the Cubans thinking they can move. I don't know. I'd like to have that. But from the point of view of the opposition, and I heard it here today through your words, it has always been episodic. It has been looking to the next referendum, the next election, the next point of where there might be some inflection point or decision. But I have never seen any indication of kind of a program or a philosophy of governments or a philosophy of nation, a proyecto de nación, coming from the opposition. And if the Achilles heel of the government, which is coming upon us at some point, is an economic and financial and oil production collapse, why are you not preparing, for example, nationalism? I see no nationalism in Venezuela saying the Cubans are taking all of our money away or you know, we're giving it to that. And I see none of that out of the opposition. It's all this sort of legalistic, episodic, where's the next point that we'll go to? Rather, what would it take for you to develop a program of 2 or 3 major concepts that you could then try to pry off some of the poorer people of the income distribution that are very loyal to the Chavez memory, because if they may be poor, but they're also Venezuelan and very proud of the nation. So with that, I'd like you to hold forth on that thought.
Thanks. Good. Before you answer, we had a few other questions. Maybe we can take several at the same time. Ray?
Hi, Ray Walser, formerly with Heritage and also formerly with the State Department. Just 3 sort of amplify the things. First of all, is there any sign of division within the PSUV at this particular point, especially with the leadership obviously taking the country over the financial cliff? I think that, are we seeing any sort of cracking there? I mean, obviously the people in the streets, colectivos, will follow the higher orders, but is there sort of in the mid-range, one presumes, the more rational? Secondly, you mentioned that it's the police and the National Guard. Is the Army also moving in? You showed the picture, obviously, of the Air Force flying their Sukhois over trying to scare people. Is the Army getting engaged, which I think has always been kind of a critical turning point? And secondly, you've got probably one big heck of a day coming up. If I remember, March 5th will be the first anniversary of the death of Hugo Chavez, which clearly the regime, I presume, will want to take to the streets and have something really big planned in.
Thanks. Were there other questions? We can take maybe 2 or 3. Or why don't we start with these? I would ask you, please, to limit your responses, and if both of you would like to jump in, feel free, but we have to give up the room.
I'll start because I already ended, and then I'll take on what you say.
I know, I basically would like to say that, the only people who have to leave Venezuela is the Cubans, and not anybody else. And this dialogue that has to start among the Venezuelans, and the key to getting the Cubans out of this play where they don't belong is the international community acting. And the only way that they are going to get it right is if you punish, like Ambassador Wright said, if you withhold visas, if you go after them through the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and they will understand. That's the only way. Nationalism, yes, I know. I don't think the Venezuelans are not nationalistic. I think they're afraid. Because, mind you, for 40 years, there was, albeit all these imperfections, a democratic society where there was debate, there was consensus building, there was aggregation of interests and peaceful solution of conflicts. And therefore, I don't think Venezuela, neither the opposition, anybody in Venezuela, thought ever that this was going to evolve in the way, and they were completely unprepared to fight a totalitarian regime, and they're still unprepared, the opposition, because now they're learning, but they're learning at a very high cost, because that's not a thing that you learn through theory, you have to practice, and the practice has begun to be very, very dear, the cost that they're paying. I don't think also that it has helped the fact that Venezuela, because of its cultural heritage and because of the way the economy has always functioned in Venezuela, which, by the way, comes from his Spanish heritage, whereby whatever wealth there is in the underground, it belongs to the state, the crown, the government. So all all peoples that come from this tradition are very good at extracting rent, but they are not good at creating value. And the only thing that really liberates you from the state is when you create value. And so otherwise you have corporativist societies. And that's what you're seeing in Venezuela at play over the last 15 years. Because if you are extracting rent from the oil production, that you produce a service that is viable only because there is an oil production, then you are going to have your interests intertwined somehow with the people who command the Venezuelan state. And you have seen this, what they are learning. They're learning because there is nothing else left. And the only thing that is left is oil, and the only ones that want the oil desperately are the Cubans.
Yeah, I would just give some thoughts on some of the issues that were addressed to me, and I think Bea did a fantastic job saying what you just said. About the program. There is a program. And before I say this, I want everybody in the audience to understand that you have trees of apples and you have trees of oranges. You can't ask oranges to the trees of apple, to the apple tree. The Mood is a tree for apples, not for oranges. The Mood is designed institutionally to put together a coalition of different forces that go from Bandera Roja, who was a extreme left Chavista movement that participated till the very end in the urban guerrilla movement in Venezuela, where the last resistance pole of the guerrillas in the 60s, to right-wing organizations. So it is difficult to demand beyond the Constitution more than that as the ground of the program. But we do, even with that diversity of opinion, have a program. We have a general, if you jump into www.unidadvenezuela.org, there are hundreds of documents there that show what we call the minimum platform, which is the commitment that all these variety of political parties have. And we have communicated that to the country in a way that has allowed us to escalate from 37% we got in the election where Manuel Rosales was the candidate in 2006 to 50%, to say, to be honest. I mean, if you can go out of this room and say, well, I don't agree with Leopoldo Martinez when he said that Capriles won the election. Yeah. But you have to agree with me that it was a 50-50 election. So we've escalated from 37 to 50. Which means that we're bringing more and more Venezuelans every day. We keep doing the job we're doing with the Mesa de Unidad Democrática and the way we are conducting the leadership of the Mesa de Unidad Democrática. So for us, as Bea said, it's also a learning process because we also adapt the fight and focus the fight. For instance, in the electoral front, we learned every election more and more on how to make it for them more difficult and more complex to use fraud. In the recall referendum of 2004, we did not have. If you ask me, did you win the recall referendum against Hugo Chavez in 2004? I honestly have to say that I think we didn't, but I don't have any way to tell you if we did, because we did not have witnesses or electoral control on 90% or 80% of the territory. In this last election, the government had, in the April 14th election, the government had to take out our witness by 4 p.m. in 2,000 polling stations by force. They used force to get them out of the polling stations when they were bringing people to vote through what they call assisted voting. The legislation says that you must assist somebody who's blind, somebody who's old to vote. Well, they practically assisted hundreds of people whose doors were knocked at 5 p.m. saying, you haven't voted, you're a beneficiary of X or Y program, come and vote. So we've learned every little detail, and every time we go to an election, believe me, we develop technology, we develop, it's a work miracle. A few months ago, we went to Lima, maybe a year and a half ago or a year ago. We went to Lima to the World Movement for Democracy. It's a fantastic assembly we put together every year, and many organizations go. We always go by the net. And I met people from a significant number of countries that do face regimes of nature like the one we have in Venezuela. And they all said, we don't have something like the mood. We regret that we don't have something like the mood. So what I'm saying is, let's demand apples to the apple tree and oranges to the orange tree. The orange tree are the leaders. They are the ones who have to develop the message and communicate the message with the strategy to continue to increase our political base. And this is exactly what Enrique Capriles has been saying in the evolution of this protest. We have to understand that among the 5,000 conflicts that have taken place in the country in 2013, grossly 68% are Chavista-driven demands and conflicts. So it's not the same message for someone in these marches today, the ones we're seeing, that the message to a person who is a Chavista, who wants Maduro in power, or maybe voted for Maduro, but is demanding that his house that was supposed to be delivered to him with title last month is not being constructed. That he went to the piece of land assigned to him, and there's not a brick in the land. So he's demanding his house. So how do you do that? We need to develop a strategy and a message that does not create that short circuit of communication with that portion of the people, because we need to bring a landslide to this side. So that's why the mood is very carefully working through the own measure that we have as an institution, which is sitting these people around the table and define that strategy in a situation where we don't have an electoral episode in the next few months, but only in 2015 when we are going to the parliamentary elections. And we're in the middle of that debate. The mood is trying to adapt to this new reality. And somebody mentioned about Diosdado and Maduro. And I think you also made a question about that, the tension. On the constitutional issue, Cabello had to be the transitional president for a few days until the election was held. The only thing that they really circumvented there with a decision of the Supreme Court was whether Maduro could be the sitting president and the candidate at the same time, and they violated the Constitution in many ways, and that's part of the claim that we made to the international authorities after we were rejected by the Supreme Court. But Maduro was chosen. I know Maduro and Diosdado very well. I was a congressman for Miranda, and he was a governor when I was a Congress, after my governor lost the election to him, at that time Enrique Mendoza. And I had to sit with him because I was the representative of the National Assembly in what was called the Public Policy Coordination Committee, where representatives of Congress also sit. So I know the man. I've been in a room like this talking to the man. And I know Maduro because I sat in Congress with him for 5 years, and he was a member of the Boston Group, by the way, an initiative that put together reconciliation efforts among parliamentarians. So I've traveled with the man. I know them very well, and I of course know that Maduro is a man closer to Cuba than Diosdado is. But that tension, and I need to conclude, but I want to say this very important, that tension doesn't get us to lose our focus. If they're fighting or they're together, we just have to focus, regardless of that fact, in our own unity. Because there is nothing we can achieve if we, banking on their division, do not preserve our unity. There's no way we can defeat these people in an institutional fashion if we don't preserve the unity of the opposition. And we cherish that unity. If they're fighting, they're fighting. If they're not fighting, we will know. I always say that interest have them together, interest will split them. But the only thing we need to be certain is that the day they split, we're united. And that's where we are. That's our platform for. So demand apples for the apple tree, from the apple tree, demand oranges to the orange tree. We're not the orange tree. We are the apple tree. That's what the mood is about.
And I think that that will have to be the final comment from an excellent panel and an excellent session. And
Mark, can I say just something?
Well, then that will have to be the next to last comment. We have the last comment now from.
I know that they're here, present members of staff of Congress, congressmen and women. I have heard that there is perhaps an initiative to curtail sales of gasoline to Venezuela. That would increase the pain of the Venezuelan people while getting the government more strong. Because the people of the Chavistas who follow them are going to see the aggression coming from the United States, and we are going to have the same story over and over and over again repeated with a policy that doesn't work and that is going to work to the detriment of the United States and to the people of Venezuela. That is a very bad idea, and I think it shouldn't even be considered.
And I think that on that subject and on what specific strategies can be taken by the international community, we could have another session just focus on that. I think it's important to have that discussion, and we may even have a diversity of views on that, which is part of what democracy is all about. But what I think we do not have any diversity of views on is the facts. And the facts that are taking place today in Venezuela, which is the reason why we're gathered here today, is a situation of crisis in which spontaneously a large and growing number of peaceful Venezuelan students, joined now by average citizens throughout the country, are daily protesting at great risk to themselves because they possess no arms. They're doing this in a peaceful manner, and yet there have been deaths, there have been injuries, there are currently a number of people still in prison. There are a number of people unaccounted for, there are official numbers, and then there are estimates unofficially that these would be much larger than what they are. We don't know today what the end result of these protests are going to be. We, of course, hope that this will result in a positive process in Venezuela. But frankly, I have to say that given the track record of the Venezuelan government, despite the fact that it pays lip service to dialogue and peaceful pluralism with other points of view, I think that its actions have shown something else. It seems to me that something else that we can all agree on is that the role of people of goodwill around the world, the role of governments, of democratic governments, is to support them and to ensure that the principles of democracy, the principles of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, a consensus document signed by every single country in the hemisphere except for Cuba, including Venezuela, are respected. And I think that that's really the most important point right now. This is a crossroads for Venezuela. Of course, nothing that we say here or do or that no foreign government will determine the destiny of Venezuela. That's in the hands of the Venezuelans to decide. But we hope that they do so in an atmosphere of respect, of peace, listening to all of the different perspectives. I think that that's what we have to continue to do and call on the international community and our governments to keep an eye on what takes place and what violations to human rights, basic human dignities are taking place. So thank you all for being here, for taking the time to come on a Friday, on a rainy Friday. Thank you, and please join me in thanking our excellent panelists. And especially thanks to the Heritage Foundation for its leadership on this subject, and to Ana Quintana for convening us. And Ana, I don't know if you have any closing remarks that you'd like to offer.
Just on behalf of the Heritage Foundation, I'd like to thank you all for coming out today, and I urge you all to continue following the situation in Venezuela. We don't think we've seen the worst of it. I think the situation is still unraveling, and it's definitely something I think more people need to be paying attention to. So on that note, have a great weekend.
Thank you.